President-elect Donald Trump there at Mar-a-Lago. First, he introduced the CEO of SoftBank, a Japanese company that plans to invest $100 billion in the U.S. Then he went on to take questions for quite some time. He spoke about a wide range of topics, including the turmoil in Syria, saying former dictator Bashar al-Assad was a butcher. He also talked about the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, speaking about Ukraine's President Zelensky, saying that he needs to make a deal. He also says he had a good conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He would not answer a specific question about Iran. He was also asked whether he believes there's a link, or was asked about the polio vaccine. Just a slew of different topics there in the last about hour or so. We've got executive editorial producer here with us, John Santucci, Catherine Falders as well. Guys, there was so much discussed here. Yeah. Including a whole list. The wall on the southern border, immigration, talking about the transition, calling it a friendly takeover, cutting regulations. John, I want to start with you. What stood out to you?
I mean, how much time you got, right?
I know. Just the top two.
Yeah, I mean, I think a bunch of different topics. I think, first of all, we know that Donald Trump has been working the phones, talking to foreign leaders. This press conference clearly gave light to that, right? Talking about conversations he had with Benjamin Netanyahu, issuing warning about hostages being held in the ongoing tension between Israel and Hamas. So that was fascinating. The conversations that a deal needs to be made between Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin. But even like just the random things that were talked about, right? Like you touched a little bit there, coming back to our viewers, about what's RFK going to do on vaccines. Donald Trump issuing a very clear, directive: don't worry about polio, talking about people he remembered from his childhood who were infected with the disease. Nothing's going to happen there. But even other random notes, like, saying, he has a warm spot in his heart for TikTok. We know that is a social media app that federal courts so far are holding up a ban. It would ultimately go to the Trump White House for something to do there. I mean, the list goes on and on, saying that he may pardon the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, who's under federal indictment right now. So Catherine, Emily, I mean, my list was everywhere. I mean, it was, I think, for people that have said, what's this new Donald Trump administration going to be like? Much like the past, in the sense that press conferences like this, he is going to make tons of news, and clearly did that today.
He certainly did. Catherine, what else stood out to you? I mean, it is a pretty long list. There's still a couple of topics left over that you can choose from, but what stood out to you from Trump's comments?
No, it was definitely a laundry list, from everything about him talking about a conversation that he had with Netanyahu to he was, of course, asked about all of his cabinet secretaries up on the Hill, and that senators who didn't essentially support those cabinet secretaries, would they be primaried? He kind of said yes, and then kind of said no if they had the right reasons. Look, his relationship with Chinese President Xi said essentially gave us a little bit of a window into that, which we had known, of course, before, but he said they've had a good relationship. But it went a little bit downhill during COVID. He said it's not bad, but, it kind of fell off a bit. Of course, that was asked in the context of if he would, about the inauguration, essentially, if he had been told that she won't be attending. He said, well, he didn't really know that. Some people say he will. Some others say that he won't attend. The blanket pardons was interesting here. We've talked a lot about January 6th and if he would pardon people involved in January 6th. He said similarly to what we've heard, but it was more couched a bit. He said, you'll find out. Of course, he'll be doing that quickly, potentially on the first day. He said, as John had noted, that he'll sign a number of things on day one. We know he is going to sign a flurry of executive orders, but he said, and some other things. What are those other things? We've talked a lot about whether it be pardons, other executive actions. So that's, of course, another thing to look out for. It was interesting, too, on the questions asked by Selena Wang on the vaccines, polio vaccine in particular, which has come under scrutiny given what RFK has said. Trump said he's a big believer in it, that being the polio vaccine. Selena followed up saying, does Trump think schools should mandate vaccines? Now, that's where Trump said that he is against vaccines, that he doesn't like that. So, of course, that was newsworthy, too. But as John mentioned, a slew of headlines. It brings us back to the old days where we're literally told that Trump will make remarks to the press, and here we are an hour and a half later, and he's still taking questions. So we'll likely see more of that in the future.
Yes, we're just getting started, right? Elizabeth, Trump says tariffs will make America rich. Of course, this was announced as this announcement from SoftBank, right? Investing $100 billion. We saw Trump there trying to push it up to $200 billion. What do you make of this announcement by SoftBank? And what do you think? Will they end up investing in the U.S., or is this just kind of a show before the actual transition?
Definitely a pledge and a promise, and you saw Trump try to negotiate kind of in real time there, say the company's committing to $100 billion. Okay, let's just make it $200 billion right now. And Masayoshi Son, the head of SoftBank, sort of said, I'll look into it, but I'm promising you $100 billion, which is a significant number. We'll have to see where that money actually comes from. SoftBank does not have that much cash on hand, so where they will get that money is a big question. And of course, how many jobs it creates, we'll have to see. But it does speak to something. We heard a lot of Trump talking about this idea that businesses are fully embracing him and just going all in on him this time around. He talked about all the CEOs he's met with, like the founder of Google, we know Amazon, Meta. These companies have really been warming up to him. He says that he is the most pro-growth president, which is something we heard a lot in his first term. But now he's saying they've really come around and they're not even really rejecting any of his ideas, despite some of those policies that he's put forward that might not be so great for global businesses like tariffs. But Stephanie, I was struck. He did not talk about tariffs very much during this hour and a half of remarks. He's really kind of focused on those policies like lower corporate tax rates, less red tape for companies, deregulation. Those are seen as the bucket of economic policies that are generally good for the stock market, for companies' bottom line. Did not highlight really till the very end there some of those red flag policies when it comes to how it could impact inflation, how it could impact households, tariffs especially. Staying away from that maybe because he knows that's what worries businesses more. And we know that Donald Trump loves to see the stock market up. He says he's going to continue to see stock market gains under his term, just as we saw under his first term, though I will note so far the S&P 500 has outperformed under President Biden compared to Trump this term.
Very good point, Elizabeth. John, you've got a lot of history with a President-elect Trump, a President Trump. You saw this 4 years ago where companies stepped up and said, we're going to invest this now that you're going to be in office. This is what we're going to do here in the U.S. Do you remember those companies actually following through?
No, but also I think this is very different. I mean, I don't remember a world of Eli Lilly and Pfizer going over for dinner at Mar-a-Lago, right? I don't remember a world of, Meta and Mark Zuckerberg cutting $1 million check. I mean, this is very, very different. And I think that what's interesting about this time versus last time in 2016, beginning 17, before he went to Washington, so much of that was public. You saw him, there were two jokes. Catherine and I were doing it together. In one world, you were inside watching who'd go up the golden elevator in Trump Tower. The other, Falders, you'll remember this, we froze out in Bedminster before there were drones, outside watching who was going into his golf club there, because then he was living in New York. This time around, it's so much more private and secretive, but you're actually hearing the news coming from the business leaders. And look at SoftBank as an example, right? People are communicating more publicly their dealings with the incoming Trump administration. We're not seeing it with our own, two eyes, if you will. And that's where I think this is very different. And Donald Trump said that a little bit towards the end of his hour-and-a-half press conference today. People are being nicer to me, friendlier to me. Code, they're giving me more money for things. It's just very, very interesting, I think, the juxtaposition to then and now. The other thing I would just say, too, is that, I think that Donald Trump is obviously taking a very different approach than Joe Biden did 4 years ago. I know that's shocking, but Donald Trump, you'll recall, was president. Joe Biden won. Joe Biden had the phrase one president at one time, right? Donald Trump, at the top of his remarks, was almost giving directives to the Biden administration, right? Things that I want you to look into, things that I want you to deal with. Even talking about something like the drones, right? Everybody's talking about that story. You've been covering it a lot with Johnson this morning on our air. Just saying that, look, they're over Bedminster, over New Jersey. A local mayor was on Good Morning America this morning and said exactly that. He was not far from Bedminster. The fact that Donald Trump is commenting in the way he is in an event like that, I do wonder what you'll see the ramifications of that being. Does the Biden administration do anything about it, or do his loyalists on Capitol Hill take any of that up now in the next couple of weeks before he's back in office?
And Trump also saying that the government is behind these drones when the federal government is saying they're working on this together with local mayors. I mean, that kind of adds to the mistrust.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit of the conspiracy theories. But nevertheless, I think I do, you come back to this morning, right? Local mayors saying they're not getting anything from the federal government. Trump pushing just now, saying, say something, anything, just to give people a little peace of mind.
Yeah. Catherine, Trump says he has a warm spot for TikTok. I'm sure you heard that. So he also commented on how it helped him with young voters. So what do you make of that, and what are you watching for there as TikTok is moving closer and closer to a deadline?
Yeah, well, it seems like it did help him. And as John pointed out earlier, too, he said he has a soft spot for TikTok, and he wavered, frankly, on what exactly he would do with that. Now, remember, this ban is essentially going into effect next month, I believe, January 19th. So there's not much time here. How he will look at it, what exactly he will do. But he did equate that with the youth vote, and we know that. And we've talked a lot about that here, about how he believes that whether it's the presence on TikTok, whether it's him going on these podcasters, for example, Joe Rogan, that he did do a lot in those later stages, especially of the campaign, to try and turn out the younger votes. So yes, this is something that happened and was obviously going into effect under Joe Biden's presidency. But what does Trump do in that time when he gets back in office? He doesn't have I don't totally know his mechanism and what he will do with this. I know that the courts have weighed in, the appeals courts have weighed in. So it remains to be seen exactly what he will be able to reverse here. I do know that this is something that his lawyers have discussed, at least preliminarily behind the scenes, as a way to potentially reverse this when it goes into effect.
Yeah. And John, let's talk about Ukraine a bit.
Yeah.
Trump mentioned Ukraine, talked about some of the cities that have been destroyed, mentioned Kyiv. I spent some time in Kyiv before Russia invaded. How much pressure do you think he and his team will put on Zelensky to give up land or make some sort of a deal?
I don't think I need to interpret anything. I think take Donald Trump as his words just earlier, Stephanie, right? He said Zelensky's got to make a deal. Putin's got to make a deal. Donald Trump brands himself as the ultimate deal maker, right? So is that where he is going to step in and broker a conversation between both of those leaders? I mean, clearly, we all know this, right? We've all made a deal at some point in our lives, right? You get a little to give a little, right? So imagine that is going to be a topic of conversation. And, I think that what you're seeing from Donald Trump right now is that he is getting calls from these foreign leaders. Some of them he's making, some of them he claims he's receiving. He said he's received over 100 world leaders calling him at this point. He said he had an interaction with Zelensky while he was over at the reopening of Notre Dame. President Macron invited him, as we know. So I do think that that's going to be something that's going to be a priority one for Donald Trump, right? Trying to calm things down in the world, in the Middle East. Obviously, we talked about the situation with Israel and Hamas not too long ago as well. But I think that one of the things that we know Donald Trump has talked about, right, is that he can, be the ultimate deal maker, right? He can bring those people together. So obviously, we know that it's been a weird situation, a weird dynamic with him and Zelensky over the years. But I think you've seen Zelensky have those overreaches to Trump so far, mentioning the trip to France, mentioning the phone calls. Imagine that is going to be something that him and his team will deal with pretty quickly.
Yeah, let's see what type of role he takes. Right. Catherine, Trump says Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's Department of Government Efficiency has already found $2 trillion to cut with no impact. So what are you watching for there?
Yeah, well, he says exactly what you just said. He said they're finding things that you wouldn't even believe, and then goes into what you just said about saving $2 trillion. This isn't going to have an impact on people. Trump says they're never going to cut Social Security, but rapidly defeat inflation. Obviously, this Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, as they're calling it, is supposed to be operating outside of the government, working with the incoming government. So I guess the question there is for Trump and for his advisors, what exactly have they found? What are their findings? How have they been digging into it? He says this, of course, this saving $2 trillion without any specifics, but he has said that they've been working behind the scenes on this. Of course, we know that there's multiple transition meetings, that they have been going through this behind the scenes. He says we're going to create millions of new jobs and put money in the pockets of hardworking Americans as it relates to these findings and what Musk and Vivek have found in terms of their saving of $2 trillion. But it's still unclear exactly how they'll do that. They haven't said so publicly. So The question really there is what more specifics can they show the American people on how this is going to work once Trump takes office.
All right, we'll see how that shapes up. Thank you guys for joining us. An hour and a half. We'll look forward to more hour and a half
We
press
just want to spend more time with you. That's really
I love
what
it. It's great. Thank you guys, John, Elizabeth, and Catherine. Thanks so much.